All right, we're going to be in our text today, Matthew chapter 26, verses 47 to 56. And the title of the sermon is, Jesus said, "Am I a violent man? Am I a violent man?" So we'll look into that. We'll read our text and then we'll exposit it together. Just a couple notes as we look through the text. We're always looking for those concrete, objective, what I call intratextual markers, things that are in the text that help point us to what the author was getting at. That was a first century Greco-Roman writing style, and we've picked up on it. Two things we're going to see in our text today. The first one is an aphorism. An aphorism is in the text, and I'll talk about that. And the second thing is we've got repetition in the text. Something gets repeated, and that's always there to draw our attention to that thing. So let's start out with the first few verses. Verse 47, Matthew 26 and verse 47. "And while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd, with swords and clubs, from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, 'The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him.' And he came up to Jesus and at once said, 'Greetings, Rabbi,' and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, 'Friend, do what you came to do.' And so they came up and they laid hands on Jesus and they seized him. And behold, one of those who was with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, and he cut off his ear." I would pause there, because the author has set up the scene, and obviously, if you pay attention to some of the certain words here that I've highlighted for you, he's painted a very violent moment, a very violent seed. He says a crowd of people came, but he doesn't just say a crowd of people came. He says a great crowd of people all came. We'll remember that at this moment, Jesus and his disciples had celebrated the Last Supper. They were comfortable in the upper room in the city, having that Last Supper. And once Jesus basically dismissed Judas, Judas goes off to betray Jesus. And while he does that, Jesus takes his disciples out of the upper room, walks them outside the city gates of Jerusalem, walks them down through the Kidron Valley of Jerusalem, which was the city limit of the city, and then walks them out to the Mount of Olives into a private garden that all of his disciples knew and were aware of. Something strange about that is the law of Moses said that you're not supposed to leave your house after you eat the Passover. So I think this is a footnote for you, but it's worth noting, well then why did Jesus and his disciples leave the house during the Passover if they weren't supposed to leave the house during the Passover meal? And I want to suggest to you that Jesus' whole goal, if you remember, Jesus prayed and said, "Father, I have not lost any of the ones that you've given me." Jesus is saying there's been no violence. There's been nothing perpetrated against the disciples. I've protected them. I was with them. I watched over them. I kept them safe. Father, I did what I was supposed to do. I kept them safe while I was with them. And you'll remember in another place, Jesus says, "While I was with you, I kept you safe. But now I'm about to go. So whoever has 2 tunics better sell one of them and buy a sword. He was saying violence is going to be perpetrated against you guys once I leave. So that's all kind of in the footnotes, all side notes. So they're in a garden in Gethsemane, and Jesus does this so that when the mob comes, he doesn't want them in the middle of the streets, in the city streets, crashing into this home with swords and clubs, because he doesn't want the violence to happen to anybody. So for that reason, he leaves the city limits, goes out to the Mount of Olives into a private garden, and his disciples know where to find him, and the crowds know where to find him. So nobody gets hurt out there. I think that's what he's done. And as we look back through the text, he says there's a great crowd that came. They brought swords and clubs with them. You have to just wonder, Jesus never ever looked like a threat. And yet Matthew makes sure that we know this massive crowd that came brought swords and clubs. They were ready to perpetrate violence. This was a violent group. In the midst of them was a betrayer, someone that had betrayed Jesus for a price. He had been bought. Bribes had been made, and then they said that the plan was made to seize Jesus. That word seize, I kind of stop on that word. It's a unique word in the Greek. It stands out and makes you kind of stop and look at it. They seized him. They grabbed him by force. They laid hands on him. And then somewhere in the midst of all this, a sword was actually, unfortunately, taken out, and violence was actually executed. Blood was shed. That wasn't supposed to happen. Jesus fixes that. And so in our common vernacular, this is called assault and battery. You've probably heard that. He was charged with assault and battery. But what those terms mean, they're 2 separate crimes, 2 separate terms. Assault is merely someone approaching you in a rage or in an anger, threatening to do violence to you. And the threat is real enough that you feel like violence is about to happen to you. Nothing has happened to you yet, but the tone of the person and their movement towards you makes you feel something bad is going to happen. That is called assault. Did you know that? Somebody doesn't actually have to touch you or lay hands on you. Assault is merely someone trying to intimidate you, threatening violence even before they've done anything. The battery is when someone actually touches you, lays hands on you, then they've committed a second crime. The second crime is battery. When we look at this scene, this intimidating crowd, this mob that comes towards Jesus, just that intimidating movement towards Jesus is battery. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let me get myself. Is battery. That's right. Thank you. Assault. Just that movement towards him was considered assault. That was a crime. But then they actually lay hands on him and take him, and now that is battery. 2 distinct, separate crimes. But as we look at this violent paragraph, you can't help but stop and look at who was Jesus. What did he do for his 3-year ministry? Loved people, healed people, blessed people, spoke to people, focused on the people in the world that don't get noticed, and he made sure that they were noticed. And so a non-violent individual gets assault and battery by a violent mob in that simple little paragraph that we read. Verse 52 in our text. And Jesus said, put your sword back into its place, because all who take the sword will perish by the sword. That there is what we call an aphorism. An aphorism. An aphorism is a small, short phrase that is a saying that carries a lot of truth with it. Our modern day aphorisms are, is it the nut doesn't fall far from the tree, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree? One of those. Either. The acorn doesn't fall far from the tree. And that has a lot of profound meaning hidden in it that you extract depending on who it's being said to. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That has a lot of meaning in it. And it's all hidden in what we call an aphorism. Well, Jesus gives this aphorism in the midst of this violent scene, in the midst of this assault and battery, when one of his own tries to protect him. He says, put away that sword. You're doing this all wrong. Don't you know that anybody that draws a sword will die by the sword? So in the midst of this violent scene, Jesus is stating, we are non-violent people. When retaliated against, Jesus said the disciples, his mission was to go to the cross. And so in this moment, Peter, you shouldn't be trying to get in the way of what is supposed to happen right now. Unique is only Matthew. In all the Gospels, in this Gethsemane scene, only Matthew uses this aphorism, any who take the sword, die by the sword. In the other Gospel accounts, something different gets said. And what gets said in the other Gospel accounts is, shouldn't I drink this cup? Shouldn't I go through with what has been written about me? So it's unique that Matthew is the only one to state this aphorism. No violence. Those who execute violence will die by violence. And I think, let's put a pin in the sermon right there, because I'm just going to give you a little bit of background and history. You might consider that since Matthew is the only one that writes this aphorism, maybe there was something going on in his audience that Matthew was trying to make his audience aware of something. When I say his audience, what I mean is Matthew writes this gospel in 85 AD. 55 years after these events happened. 15 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He's writing to a unique group of people, and he wants to remind them and let them know that Jesus said, as Christians, as believers, when we're being attacked for our faith, when we're being attacked for our Christian belief, we don't retaliate back. So what was happening, this is interesting, in 85 AD, the Jewish synagogue had had enough of Christians who were considering themselves Jews, but believing in Christ and following a whole different set of rules. And the Jewish synagogue got sick of that, and in 85 AD, they kick all of the Christians out of the synagogue, and an intense persecution of Christians happens coming from Jewish non-believers. This persecution comes from Jewish non-believers. The people that attend synagogue begin to persecute Christians that are kicked out of the synagogue. And I wish I would have given you two of these. Sometimes I'm concerned to giving you too many verses, But Revelation chapter 2 and 3 is the letters to the 7 churches. If you would read the letter to Smyrna and the letter to Philadelphia, those 2 letters, Revelations 2 and 3, those 2 letters are being persecuted, and Jesus says, I see what's happening to you. And He specifically says, and I know that it's happening because of that synagogue of Satan. They call themselves the Jews, but they're not. They're a synagogue of Satan. Can you imagine Jesus labeling the Jewish synagogue that synagogue of Satan? Well, if we look at our text today, it is exactly the Jewish leadership, the higher ups, the Jewish governing forces of the synagogues and of the temple that are the ones that are coming against Jesus with swords and clubs. Violence is already being perpetrated by this Jewish government that was in place at the time. So Matthew's readers and all the way up until Revelation. Revelation gets written in 96 AD with the death of Domitian, the Roman emperor who prohibited people from publishing things. At his death, John the Revelator publishes the book of Revelation. And so at that time, there is a massive persecution from the synagogue towards Christians. So I think that that's a good likelihood at why Matthew would choose to use this aphorism, don't fight back. You know, I find it strange, the nonviolent approach of the church towards persecution. And yet, isn't the current rhetoric that we've heard on the TV and in the news, when they go low, we go lower? We're not seeing a Christian worldview in politics today. Hopefully the Lord will change that. But anyway, those churches to Smyrna, the letter to churches Smyrna and Philadelphia, he makes that known. So, Jesus is advocating for nonviolence when Christians become persecuted. I'd like to take you on a little footnote to say Jesus advocated for nonviolence, but I think it's also very important to recognize that Jesus could have been violent. He had a very good opportunity to take Jerusalem himself by violence and become king through violence. Let me just remind you guys of that. First of all, when he was feeding the 5,000, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, it said, and they all wanted to take him and make him their king by force. Now, there's something else that's unique about that. The number 5,000 is only the men. Women and children would have taken it into 12,000, 15,000 people. 5,000 is an interesting number because the most powerful military force known at that time was called a Roman legion. And a Roman legion consisted of 5,000 men. What can you do with 5,000 men? What can you do with one Roman legion? Well, Julius Caesar rebelled against Rome, crossed the Rubicon, which meant I'm attacking Rome, with one battalion of 5,000 soldiers. Julius Caesar takes Rome with one legion of people. Julius Caesar becomes the next Roman emperor. So Jesus had a legion. He could have clearly taken Jerusalem by force. The second thing is what he says in our very pericope, verse 53. He lets everybody know, hey, I have a lot of resources at my disposal. Verse 53, do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and He will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels. Jesus is still using this Roman military term. God the Father will send me 12 legions of angels. How much damage do you suppose they could do? I'm mindful that there was a battle in the Old Testament. I can't recall what it was. But in the night, one angel of God swept through the camp and killed 185,000 soldiers. Is that right? One angel. And Jesus says, I've got 60,000 angels on their tiptoes, staring out of heaven right now. They're just waiting for me to give them the word. Violence was a great possibility. Jesus tells Pilate, and he explains this idea of violence even further, while Pilate has Jesus on trial, and he's saying, are you a king? Are you what they say you are? Are they bringing these charges against you for the right purpose? And Jesus says, yeah, I am a king. But this kingdom, the Roman kingdom, has nothing to worry about, because I'm not an earthly king. I'm a transcendent spiritual king of a different plane. Let me take you to that. John 18. And notice what he says. If I was trying to be an earthly king, you bet there would be violence. John 18 and verse 36. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. That is a profound text. That text is pregnant with meaning and insights for us. I should have spent more time on that text right there. But he says, the reason there is no violence happening right now is because I am the king of a different kind of kingdom. I didn't come to be king of Jerusalem. I came to be the transcendent king of the world. To anybody who would choose to have me as their king. I'm not going to force anybody to make me their king. Therefore, there's not going to be any need for violence, because I'm only going to be people's king voluntarily. That's why there's no violence. We don't wage war the way the world wages war. It's important that later on the apostles, when they're writing to the churches and the churches are experiencing persecution, the apostles draw on Jesus' nonviolent movement here in the garden, and the apostles say, that was an example for you. Let me take you to 1 Peter chapter 2. The apostle Peter writes to us, and he tells us, chapter 2 and verse 18, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. Be good also to unjust people. That's a tough one to swallow. If you have a boss that is unjust, be good to him. Be your best anyway. Because that's the way Jesus was. Jesus died for people who were still in their sins. People died for people who were unjust. And Peter says, you guys be the same way. Your behavior doesn't depend on whether someone is treating you well or treating you poorly. Your behavior always copies your king, if you choose to make him your king. You always copy him. Verse 19. Because this is a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. What credit is it if when you sin, you get beaten for it and you endure it? But if you do good and suffer for it, you endure. Well, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. This is a beautiful thing in the sight of God. God looks down at the Rambo of the world. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, revenge and vengeance. And God hates it. But when God sees one of His children suffering because they're doing the right thing, and violence is being exhibited against the person that is doing the right thing, and you bear up under that persecution, God looks at that and He is pleased with you. This is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Verse 21, because to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you. He left you an example so that you would follow in His steps. Verse 22, He committed no sin, neither was there deceit found in His mouth. And when He was reviled, He did not revile in return. And when He suffered, He did not threaten, but He continued entrusting Himself to the one who judges justly. I want to give you another half of embracing that Christian character of copying Jesus' example of nonviolence, non-retaliation. But we can put a pin in this sermon here. I'm going to break the flow of Matthew, but this is important. But we are not without vengeance when someone is executing persecution against us. We are not without vengeance. Because God has given certain people a sword. Here's a little bit ironic. Jesus tells His disciple, Peter, put away the sword. But what's comforting is God says, but there are people that I have given a sword. And to those people that I have given a sword, they should not bear the sword in vain. God says, if I gave you a sword, you better use it. And who is He talking about? The government, the police, the judicial system, the court system. God says that they are my servants, and I have given them a sword. That's why cops have a gun at their right side. God has given them permission to execute the wrath of God against people who are breaking the law. And that's comforting to know. Let me read that to you. Romans chapter 13 and verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities is resisting what God has appointed. Those who resist will incur judgment, because rulers are not a terror for good conduct, but for bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is good and you will receive His approval. Verse 4. For He is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, if you're a lawbreaker, if you're sucker punching old people in the subway, if you're going into Walgreens and stealing stuff without paying for it, verse 4, be afraid, because He does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on wrongdoers. Did you guys see the balance that God has given to the world? The balance is, I want my faithful disciples to be nonviolent, peaceful. But because the world is full of evil people, I have also set up governments, authorities, police, armies, judicial systems, so that when somebody does break the law, the holy divine wrath of God comes on lawbreakers through this servant that God has set up on earth, forms of government. But we're reading this story about Gethsemane. And this form of government that is set up in Jerusalem, they're not protecting the good guy. This government in Jerusalem is the treacherous one. They are the lawbreakers. The government is the violent ones. And what happens when the government begins perpetrating violence on an innocent, righteous person? That is what our text is about. And I just think it sure is interesting how sometimes sermons just seem to line up with what's happening in the world today. I always boast about the idea that I never pick the sermon. I don't grab a topic and grab a bunch of verses and just make stuff up. We go through entire books of the Bible, and I don't get to pick what comes next. And yet it always seems that if we're faithful to God's Word and we love and we exalt all of God's words, not just a couple here and there, boy, there sure is some good, meaty stuff in here. That's why we never skip anything that God has written down. So what happens when the system goes awry? What happens when the people that God has given the sword to execute wrath on lawbreakers, what happens if they are the lawbreakers and they execute wrath on the good, righteous, upright people? Jesus shows us that. Back to our verse 55. At that hour, Jesus said to these crowds, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me?" I want to stop and I want to do a little study on the word robber. In your Bibles, I'd put a square around the word robber. In the Greek, there are different words used for different kinds of criminals. One Greek word is the word for a violent criminal, assault and battery type of criminal. A different Greek word is used for a common thief, wouldn't hurt you, no violence, just a thief. And our English term for robber, unfortunately, doesn't distinguish for us It's too generic a term. So let me go underneath the word that got translated robber here. The word is less than. Less than. Let me give you the definition for this Greek word. What is a less than? Jesus is saying, have you come out against a less than? What he is saying is a violent man. A less than is someone who has perpetrated violence, assault, and battery. The definition here, less than, one who seizes by violence, political insurrectionist, a revolutionary, a rebel who favors the use of force or violence. And that's the word that Jesus uses for himself. You guys came with a mob and with swords and with clubs. Do you think you're coming up against a violent man? I think that's an important part of the translation for us. A violent person. You're coming at me as though I was a violent, out of control person. Is that what you think I am? The other word, kleptes, is the other kind of a word you may recognize. Kleptes is the word that we translate klepto, a kleptomaniac, someone that likes to steal things. That's a non-violent criminal, one who steals, a thief, a pickpocket. Unfortunately, all these words get jumbled together in English translations, and they're all called robbers. But the word for robber that Jesus uses here is lestes. Have you come upon me as though I have been a violent rebel? The use of force that they were using was like guerrilla warfare. In the minds of this crowd, now pay attention to this. In the minds of this crowd that had come against Jesus, Jesus had been so demonized by the media that these people felt that it was justified to use any amount of force to get him out of office. These people feel that it's justified to do anything they have to do to kill this person. They feel that any kind of false accusation that they have to make is worth making because we need to get rid of this guy. He needs to be extinguished by any means necessary, and whatever this crowd felt that they needed to do was justified because Jesus had been so demonized by the powers that be. That's a scary thought, that people feel justified in taking out a righteous man like Jesus. In case you were wondering or confused, I am speaking about Jesus. The story is about Jesus. Whether or not... Okay. So Jesus says, wait a minute, guys, wait a minute. Think about what's happening here. Verse 55. Day after day, I sat in the temple teaching you, and you didn't seize me then. Jesus educated people. Jesus illuminated people. Jesus exalted people. Jesus loved and showed compassion for people that the rest of the world says are not valuable. That's all he did. He was peaceful, he was passive, and he was an advocate of nonviolence. And let me take you back to Isaiah. Isaiah got a vision of the future Messiah. Isaiah saw a picture of the Christ figure. And here's what Isaiah said about the Christ figure. He will be called a wonderful counselor, the mighty God, everlasting Father, and the Prince of Peace. to establish and sustain his kingdom with justice and righteousness. Does that sound like someone you should be coming against with swords and clubs? But as we have witnessed, sometimes the system goes awry. Jesus was nonviolent, but the people surrounding him were the violent ones. Here's another irony. Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the perfect one, the Prince of Peace, is getting attacked by a system that has gone awry. Do you know we have some insights about that government force in first century Greco-Roman world, the governors of Jerusalem? Do you know we have some insights about those people? I want you to remember the word lesten. Lesten is the violent criminal. Lesten is the guy that is willing to do guerrilla warfare, whatever it takes. Do you know Jesus said that the temple was full of lestens? Let me give it to you. Matthew chapter 21, verse 13. It is written that my house will be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of lestens. You Pharisees, you Sadducees, you current governing body, you have turned the righteous house of God into a place of violence. They are the true violent ones. But they put a price on Jesus' head and accused him of being the violent one. Another testimony to that first century period, Jesus, a righteous man, was put on trial. Pilate was looking for a way out, so Pilate gives the Jewish nation an opportunity to choose what seems like a pretty decent guy over here over a leston, a violent criminal. Let me give you that verse. John 18 and verse 40. And they cried out, not this man, but Barabbas. Give us Barabbas instead. And then here's your note. Now Barabbas was a leston. Barabbas was a violent criminal. And notice what happens when violent criminals are in office. They stand in solidarity with other violent criminals. And that's exactly what happened in Jesus' trial. This violent, corrupt government stood in solidarity with Barabbas, a violent, corrupt man, preferred him because he's like them, to a righteous, upright, messianic man who was called the Prince of Peace by the prophets. In what world is that supposed to happen? So, what happens when things go awry like this? What happens? Well, in Jesus' day, I can tell you what happened in Jesus' day. Something called the Day of the Lord came. In 70 AD, Jerusalem had engaged in civil wars that were so bad that they got the attention of Rome, and Rome said, if you guys don't cut it out right now, we're coming to Jerusalem and we're going to destroy you guys. And Jews were so involved in civil war with each other that by 65 AD, Rome began sending soldiers to stop the mess that's happening in Jerusalem. And when Jerusalem fought back and killed all of those Roman soldiers, well, all they did was keep the hornet's nest. Titus, a Roman soldier, was sent to extinguish the Jews. And in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed. And if you remember one of the previous sermons, Josephus records that the number of crucified Jews was so high that the Roman army had to clear a forest of I'm getting it wrong now, a 5-mile radius. They cleared the trees on a 5-mile radius because they ran out of wood to crucify. That's what AD 70 looked like in Jerusalem. That's called the day of the Lord. God came, destroyed the nation, destroyed the government, so that righteousness could have a hope of surviving. That's why he told the disciples, a great persecution is coming, a great tribulation is coming, but be strong and be faithful and endure to the end, because I'm going to get this corrupt government out of the way. And for the sake of the elect, I'll make the time short. Otherwise, people are just going to give up. The chief priests go on interrogating Jesus. And they said, the high priest say to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. You have said it yourself, Jesus answered, but I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. We already did a big sermon exposition of Matthew chapter 24, which is where that text comes from. So I'm not going to go into it again, but Jesus didn't mean you're going to see me on the clouds. Jesus didn't mean you're going to see me coming back. Jesus meant I am going to take judgment and wrath and come against you in judgment. And ever since the crucifixion and resurrection, Jerusalem began having civil wars. They began burning food supplies. All of Jerusalem unraveled until Rome came and destroyed them in AD 70. And that was Jesus' vindication on the system that had gone awry. That was Jesus' vindication on these people that should have protected him, but instead persecuted him. And he was vindicated when God came to destroy that nation and its government. God is the one that holds all things together. And if there's any peace in any country, it's only because God is the one holding together the whole mess. But God says, if you rebel against me for long enough, then I'll let go of the order that I've brought to your country. And I'll step back and I'll let you guys reap the fruit of your actions. Let me show you that. Judges chapter 10 and verse 13. Judges 10 and 13. You have forsaken me and served other gods. So I will no longer save you. Go, cry out to the gods that you have chosen and let them save you in your time of trouble. I'm terrified by that verse. You've forsaken me for long enough. I'm out. And when everything explodes, you go to those other gods that you've been worshiping and see if they're there to help you the way they promised they would be. When the whole system collapses, you go back to the people that you thought were the right people. That's what happens when a system goes awry. God turns nations over to the very gods that they have served, the gods that they exchanged for the true God. Go ahead and do things your own way. And as we draw our sermon to a close, our last verse, verse 56, all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets would be fulfilled. And that is your repetition, guys. So that the scriptures would be fulfilled has been repeated over and over and over in chapter 26. And that's an important concept. None of this is accidental. None of this surprised God. This was all written down ahead of time. Let me take you to Zechariah chapter 13, one of the places that this was recorded, and we're going to find out, well, what happens when a system goes awry and God begins to break down the system? What about the Christians? What about the righteous? What about the remnant? What happens to them when everything is falling apart? Zechariah gives us that insight. Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 1. On that day there will be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanliness. And on that day, declares the Lord, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, so that they shall be remembered no more. Verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike that shepherd, and the sheep will all be scattered. And I will turn my hand against the little ones. The little ones here is believers, saints, the righteous. Why would God let bad things happen to righteous people? I'll turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 will be cut off and perish. 1/3 will be left alive. Here's why. And I will put this third into the fire, and I'll refine them as one refines silver, and I'll test them as gold is tested, and then they will call upon my name, and I will answer them. And I will say, they are my people. And they will say, the Lord is my God. Not one of these false gods, not one of these fake gods, not one of these imposters, not any of the people on this board of the system that has gone awry. I'm not going to be bowing at the altar of these false gods. But I will be bowing at the feet of the Lord God. Sometimes when the system goes awry, it is to flush out a purity within believers and saints, to reestablish that relationship with their God when maybe they've gotten just a little bit off track.